Continuing on, this video I'm going to talk about sort of how I would start with something like this. Start breaking it down as far as perspective and horizon lines and vanishing point, vertical line of sight. Talk about that in the other videos, as well as, very importantly, sort of the bottom of the capital A, that I like to call it. And also importantly, in a pure only vertical and horizontal rectangular sense, which is the shape, the amount of space that this drawing will take up. So it's kind of fun because as I was looking at that, it's almost looking like sort of a top hat with I think top hats would probably not have angly brims, but maybe so. But thinking of something simple like that, I wonder if that could be like a top hat, will help me when I'm just trying to sketch it out and thinking to myself, oh, does that top hat look like the top hat that I'm sketching in? I'll try to make sure that this stays in frame. That's nice of you. Usually I do that beforehand, but I'm going to start sketching in that outer rectangle, and I am looking at it while you are not looking at it. And clean up that mess a little bit. You're just going to have to print off your own version. So there I was talking about top hats, or maybe a rocket ship that is almost ready to have the top pointy part put on. Either way, I do, yes, check that out. I have been, sometimes your perception really shifts when you think of that in a good way, to be able to compare what you're drawing. That's a little bit more fun than all that darn proportions stuff. I'm going to go with that for now. Oh look, there's jelly from my peanut butter and jelly. So as far as the ellipses in here, I have some pretty detailed ones about that. But I'm just going to sketch in real lightly the placement of where I think these might go, and I'm not sort of going wide enough. I'm kind of thinking of this this rectangle when I really need to be thinking of the perspective rectangle. So let's try that again. The famous words of Daffy Duck. It's going to be something a little bit more like that. And this one would be something like that. This one is a touch lower down. Not much. And this one way back here is the hidden one that you can't see at all. So if that's sort of how I'm setting these up, next I'm going to sketch in the center so I can, the midpoint, perspective center, so I can sketch in a midline for each of the cylinders, which is an extremely helpful thing. And these are taller than I know that they're going to end up being. This is really harshing on my mellow man. I think I'll shift away from that fun but kind of messy graphite stick. Try to get a little bit more refined here. So if I'm thinking of this cylinder being something like that, I'm not looking at the exact height just right now. And this cylinder here, I'm going to shift that center over something like that. The closest one, shortest one. Ooh, that wasn't very. Very careful of you, Farron. Something like that. And this one is something where the sides would be. I'm going to recommend you don't get jelly on your drawing paper because your hand will stick every time you try to pass it. It's a good sandwich, though. So I'm doing this drawing through, and that can be tricky. I have it in my mind. I've done this a few times. I've been studying this and looking at it and practicing it, so I have a decent idea of what's going on. I think I'm going to try to sketch in the actual heights of these cylinders, and I'm doing that partly by, sometimes I just think of the top of each cylinder, and sometimes I think of the major axis of each top cylinder here. That is another good discussion. But I'm just trying to get a general idea and kind of measuring how high things seem relative to the full height and to the midway point. It's all very fast and very inaccurate, I'm sure, but awfully fun. So this one I think is probably, yeah, I think maybe that was a pretty good spot. Maybe that is a pretty good spot. And then this one being at the top. Sort of lost this. I don't know that I ever put in the sides of that back one. Going to be a little more careful with this guy because I know it overlaps this furthest one. And speaking of overlapping, one of the reasons it's so important to make sure you understand these ellipses on the floor plane is to make sure that none of them are actually overlapping each other, because that wouldn't happen. Unless you had cylinders that were intentionally fused and sharing the same space. But that's something to help with this whole placement as well. So there I was thinking about this back one being a little bit wider. I'm going to come back in just a sec and clean things up. So yeah, this needs a decent amount of cleaning up, because right now it's just more confusing than ever. Okay, not than anything else, but it is very confusing. Just going to knock those back. I still see where things are, so it's not like I just wasted all that time. And it was fun, so I didn't waste it at all. Let's see. Slow down a little here. Gonna think about this closest, the top ellipse of this closest candle. And that is too open. In the photograph, this candle seems a little bit like the top surface is slightly angled, so it may seem a little bit more open than technically it would be. And the important thing for each of these cylinders is to make sure that this lower ellipse is more open than the upper ellipse in this scenario where these things are lower than my eye level. So that's a decent idea for for that one. Not this one. I know, well, never mind. It's important to be able to sort of sketch through. I'm looking at the photograph and it seems like that is would be a little bit further. Which means it's getting close to that one. But if this was the top, the ellipse for the top would be getting pretty closed. Maybe even a little more closed than that. And once again, if all of this is brand new, then I take the time to sort of imagine that rectangle, the major axis, the minor axis, these 4 points. I'm going to say that's okay for now. Let's do this one now. I am going to look back here and I'm going to nudge this one over. That makes sense with my reference. But one thing I want to point out, you may have noticed that this was an initial sketch of the outer cylinders. And I really did sort of shift things around and make things taller and shorter, more depending on, it's subtle, but just kind of depending on what I felt like having these things be, and knowing how all these ellipses relate to the horizon, you can do that, which is nice. I'm going to try to sort of stick with the photo, and like I say, that wasn't that different. In particular, composition-wise, if you are overlapping something, it's very helpful to make it very clear what is in front and what is behind. These two lines, this edge and this edge, are pretty darn close to each other. So what I would do if I was drawing this, I would shift it over a little bit to make sure it's clear that this cylinder is indeed in front of that cylinder. So there's more overlap. The original, I believe, is something like that, where I'm mixing up all sorts of subjects. And I'm not getting sort of closed enough in my ellipses as I get higher, closer to horizon. I'll keep adjusting there. And this one will need a decent amount of love too. But that's okay for now. And then the final top one.